When I was about 10, my brother Bill, who was 12 years older, 22 and just out of college, made a hitchhiking trip across the USA to California. I was filled with admiration for that adventure of his. He would send back postcards from time to time. I remember he sent one back from Arizona, from the petrified forest. I loved that phrase, the petrified forest. It really made the mind work to try to imagine what it was like. I could see him standing at the side of the road in the desert somewhere or in the mountains, his thumb stuck out, and he had a dreamy gaze off into the distance as cars zoomed past him one after another, indifferent, uncaring, until finally one stopped, and he climbed in, and who knew what sort of adventure he might have with these drivers, what conversations they would have, in what accents. I tried to imagine it all and couldn't, but the seed was planted. I wanted to be there on the side of the highway, doing the same thing. Now, I thought Bill must have been brilliant to have come up with this concept of hitchhiking out to the West Coast and all around the country, wherever he wanted to go, all by himself. He had come up with the idea, as far as I knew. Now, it's true, looking back on this decades later, I saw that this would have been in 1959, 2 years after Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road came out, strongly suggesting that it was not Bill's idea originally, and it wasn't Kerouac's idea originally either, to wander the country. People had been doing this for decades, for eternities, for as long as people were people. They'd been out drifting around the world. And so 5 years later, when I was 15 in 1964, and found myself in France, in Avignon, at the end of a summer language school session, free for several weeks to roam wherever I pleased, I could hitchhike. And I did. Didn't matter to me that I was only 15 and Bill had been 22. There's the difference there. But no one knew where I was. I was free to do as I pleased. And so I headed north up the main road from Avignon towards the small town of Valence in France, and eventually up clear to Liège in Belgium. Then I swung back down around and visited a friend I knew in Toul, France, a girl who had been in the same language school session I had been. And from there I hitched east to Geneva, Switzerland, then swung back around, went through Toul again, and continued west, eventually to Paris. By this time, I was running short on funds. Some money that my parents were supposed to have wired me had not come through. I was broke. And I went to the extreme that I had hoped to avoid of calling up one of the numbers Dad had given me of various people he knew around Europe. This phone number was for a man named Mike Harris, who was in the hierarchy of this large organization called OECD. I called his number, and he said, "Sure, we'd be glad to put you up. We've got an apartment here in the 16th arrondissement. Just take a taxi and give the man the number Rue Spontini 73 and buzz our buzzer, Harris. The concierge will let you in, and you can stay with us for as long as you please. I'll be happy to lend you some money if you need some. Art can pay me back later." Art was my father. I went and stayed with them. They were a very friendly family. They had 2 young daughters I liked. One was 5 years older than I was. She was 20. That was Susie, and Katie was about 12 at the time. We went on walks together and talked about this and that. It was very enjoyable. But what was most enjoyable to me as a 15-year-old on the loose in Paris for the first time on my own was when I got to ride in the car of the Harris family. They had a chauffeur because Mr. Harris had this ambassadorial rank. They'd been granted a car and driver. And this man who drove, Monsieur Robert, we all called him. That wasn't his last name, we just called him Monsieur Robert. He observed excellent etiquette in all manners, but he wasn't stiff. He was friendly. He was happy to point out to me any buildings, famous or not famous, along the way, and could explain their context, what was governmental, what was a nice cafe, what was this and that. And he wore a dark blue suit. I think the car was also a dark blue car. It wasn't a gigantic limousine. It was a modest, largish car for France in those days, which would have meant a fairly small car for America in those days of great big, exquisitely finned cars of mammoth size. It was fun driving with him, riding around, seeing the city from his vantage point. So I was pleased when it came to the end of my visit to ask Mr. Harris first if this would seem appropriate, and then ask Monsieur Robert, when I had permission to, if he, Monsieur Robert, would be willing to drive me to the northern outskirts of Paris so I could continue my hitchhiking trip up to the English Channel, which the French called La Manche, meaning the sleeve. And it is, if you look at a map, roughly in the shape of a sleeve, larger at one end than the other. I was going to go to Calais, get the ferry boat across to England, and then make my way, either by train or hitchhiking, on to London, where I was to meet my parents a few days later. My parents had no idea at the time that I was staying with the Harrises. They had no idea, really, where I was in all of Europe during these few weeks of break that I had. Monsieur Robert, when I asked him, was very dubious about this proposition. But I insisted. And as we drove, he was still dubious about it. He said, now this idea of doing autostop, Monsieur Richard, is that really a good idea? Because he called me Monsieur Richard. I liked that. 15 years old, and I was being called Monsieur. Monsieur Robert, I said, it's important to me to travel this way because this is the best way to learn about the people in a country. They always say that to learn a foreign language, the best thing to do is immerse yourself in the country. Go live there, travel around and meet the plain folk of the country, the regular people in large cities and small towns. And there's no better way of meeting regular folk than hitchhiking. All sorts of people stop for me when I hitchhike. I've learned this already in my hitchhiking from the south of France in Avignon, where I was driven by people with Midi accents, southern accents, who wanted to stop and share the best kinds of food that came into their minds with this American newcomer to their country, and on up through the middle of France, up to the northeast toward Liège. I met all sorts of people, and they were all very friendly and generous, and I never would have met them otherwise, these people, if I'd been taking the train or flying or any of these other ways of traveling. Monsieur Robert had nothing to say to this. He had never done auto stop. He had never hitchhiked anywhere. It seemed strange to him. He was a respectable, middle-class person, and he liked safety. He said, Monsieur Richard, it pains me to picture you on the side of the road, all by yourself, at the mercy of anyone who might stop. I feel like I'll be abandoning you to the world when I leave you on the edge of the road here in the north of Paris. I don't like this idea. I'd much rather, why don't we turn around and I'll drive you back to one of the train stations, Gare Saint-Lazare or the Gare du Nord, whichever one. I think Saint-Lazare There's trains there that go up to the channel, and I will pay for your ticket. If you'd rather, you could consider it a loan and you could pay me back later. But it would make me so relieved to know that you were going to be safe on your way up to the English Channel and to London. I would sleep better tonight knowing that. I considered this proposal. It seemed I would be doing him a kindness to let him buy me a train ticket so that I could go in total middle-class safety by train up to the English Channel and beyond. I don't think I knew the term existential yet at this point, at the age of 15, but I had made a decision to lead an existential life here in my mode of travel, and I stuck to it. I said, "That's very kind of you, but I really must travel this way. I take full responsibility for anything that happens to me. It's by my own choice." So we arrived at the road that led to Chantilly, which was pretty much north of Paris, maybe off to the east just a little bit. There were two roads. One went up to Chantilly, and the other, I think, eventually went up to Beauvais. I'm not quite sure. I remember all that, but I chose the road to Chantilly, partly because I loved the sound of the word. Monsieur Robert was very sad depositing me along the roadway. We picked a spot where there'd be plenty of room for a car to pull off on the shoulder safely and for me to climb in without any conflict with the traffic. I got my backpack out of the car, and then, with obvious regret, he made a slow U-turn and drove back into the heart of the city. And there I was, on the side of the road, all by myself. Not a soul in the universe knew I was there, except Monsieur Robert. And within a few minutes, Monsieur Robert wouldn't know where I was. Once I got picked up by someone and headed towards Chantilly, or wherever the driver proposed, if it appealed to me. So I stood there in the warm sunlight of the August afternoon, my thumb out, my eyes looking as dreamy and poetic as I could possibly arrange them for a 15-year-old American adolescent on his own in France. A mysterious figure in the afternoon, I liked to think. But my luck seemed to be good. After about 20 minutes of waiting, I was pleased to see a rattle-trap sort of car lurch to a stop down the road from me. The driver had stopped fairly precipitately. I picked up my backpack and trotted after the car, threw my backpack in the trunk. I climbed in, and off we zoomed. And we did zoom. This driver drove fast. He was a burly little fellow, highly muscled, in a t-shirt with massive muscles in his shoulders and arms, and he seemed to be exuding energy and muscularity. And this energy he exuded was mostly angry energy at the world outside. He didn't seem angry at me beside him, but rather angry at the other motorists on the road. And he wanted to drive faster than all of them. There was a 3-lane road with a passing lane in the middle for both directions to share. A rather risky arrangement. So our lane going this way and a passing lane in the middle when the lines in the road said it was okay for us to pass. America used to have roads like that too, but doesn't have so many of them anymore. Probably because they're rather risky propositions, because you get a chancer like this guy behind the wheel, and maybe he's going to disregard the lines on the road, the signs along the road, and he's going to pass whenever he feels like passing. If one car was passing another car going our direction, and they were both going too slowly to suit him, this character, my driver, would shoot into the 3rd lane the oncoming lane and pass both of these cars that were going too slow, which sometimes created hysteria, panic on the part of the oncoming cars, who would slam on their brakes, honk, and pull halfway into the ditch to avoid him. He was fearless, this man. I didn't sit there wishing I'd taken the train instead. This character was fairly intriguing, actually, but the question I kept asking myself was, how fearless was I? Did I want to tell him, well, I've decided I really would rather get out right here and take my chance with another driver, or I've decided, no, I'm going to go off towards Luxembourg all of a sudden, if that's where Luxembourg was? The supposition seemed to be, now that I was in his car, I was in his power as well. I thought maybe it was best not to upset him any more than somehow he seemed to be upset internally anyway. At least he wasn't angry with me. I asked him what crops he thought they were growing along the road. Was that wheat? Was it oats? I didn't know the names of many crops, but I did know blé, whatever that is. Is that wheat? I think it might be wheat. I asked him if it was blé. He didn't know. He didn't care. Je m'en fous, he said. I don't give a damn what it is, what crops are. And then eventually he asked me, since I had a foreign accent in my French, because we were speaking French together, my broken French, he said, well, where are you from? And I said, oh, I'm from the US. I'm American. Oh, you are? And his manner changed abruptly. The anger he had been projecting out at the world suddenly was focused on me. American? He didn't care for Americans, this man. Most French people in those days, the mid-60s, did like Americans, or at least professed to like Americans when they met me. This man hated Americans. He hated all Americans, he told me. He hated all things American. When I brought up the topic of JFK, John F. Kennedy, who had been assassinated 9 months earlier, and for whom I was still in deep mourning, as were most French people still in deep mourning for John Kennedy, this man said, I'm so glad he was killed. He was a monster. I didn't like him at all. So I didn't ask him if he had liked JFK's wife, Jackie, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, whom the French had considered a wonderful figure, a diplomatic marvel, a perfect woman. She spoke fluent French. She was beautiful. She wore the gowns of Givenchy. To have her as the first lady for your nation. I didn't think I'd ask this man what he thought of Jackie. I didn't think he'd care for her somehow, if he'd been so glad her husband had been gunned down. At one point he said, I'm so glad they give out guns in America. It's wonderful that this man could buy a gun in a mail order catalog and just shoot the president. I'm glad it happened. You have a great country that way. Guns everywhere. That's terrific. When I questioned him very delicately about why he disliked America, it turned out he had once gone to the Soviet Union. They hadn't turned him down when he wanted to go there. They had granted him a visa. He had traveled there for a few weeks. And then several years later, when he'd applied for an American visa to go visit the USA, he'd been rejected because he'd been to the Soviet Union. This was the days of the Cold War. We hated the Russians hated us. No one trusted anyone else. So we weren't granting visas to anyone who'd been to the USSR, this man included, and he was very bitter. What could I say to that? Apologize for the bureaucrats of my country? I did say, well, monsieur, I'll grant you, my country is not perfect. We have our flaws. We haven't been good to the black people in our country. We've been very bad to them for centuries. Monstrous. we've been very bad in a number of ways. But we have some goodness in us too. I think all nations have good and bad in them. He listened to that in silence. And then he said, Tu vois ce forêt là-bas à l'horizon? See that forest up ahead on the horizon? I said, Oui, je le vois, monsieur. I see it, yes. Quand nous arrivons à ce forêt là-bas, je vais t'étrangler. When we get to that forest up there, I'm going to do something to you, he was saying. I could understand that whole sentence except the crucial word toward the end of it, a verb. I knew it was a verb, and I knew it was something he was going to do to me, je vais t'étrangler. But I wasn't sure what this étrangler meant. I'd never heard that verb before, not in my study classes, not in my various forms of immersion in French society. But here I was immersed in another situation, and I had heard this verb, étrangler, étrangler, let's see now. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed to resemble, in an uncanny fashion, the English verb to strangle. Was he going to strangle me at that forest up ahead? It seemed like that was the likely meaning of what he had said. I was hoping it meant something else. Like maybe, I'm going to give you a cupcake when we get to that forest up ahead. We're going to stop and share a snack or something. But I doubted that. It didn't seem to make sense. By now he was driving with his left hand on the wheel and his right arm along the seat back, with his hand somewhere behind my head. But I wasn't thinking about that until I sensed his fingers around my neck, tightening around my neck, squeezing my neck with his hand, and then releasing it. T'as peur? He said. You scared? Well, I didn't know what to say to that. Should I say yes, I was scared? Would that create a degree of empathy in him, make him back off? Or would it encourage him? Should I say no, I wasn't scared? Would that challenge him to show me that I should be scared? Finally, I said, Non, j'ai pas peur, monsieur. Trying to keep my tone as neutral as I could. No, I'm not scared. Because in fact, I wasn't scared. I was kind of baffled by this whole thing and intrigued and stunned that he hated me so much. But I couldn't see why he would hate me. I was just another guy out in the world. He was a guy out in the world. We had met, and there's all this hostility all of a sudden, talking about how great America was with all its guns and all its people killing each other with guns, how terrific that was. He loved that. He seemed to like the idea of blood and mayhem, force ruling the world. He hated America. He admired the violent impulse, but he hated the country for what it had done to him. I did say to him after a while, Now, monsieur, you have to understand that my parents live in Beauvais, up the road. It's beyond Chantilly. I know where Beauvais is, he said. Okay, well, my parents live there, and my mother's very nervous about my hitchhiking this way. I'm supposed to arrive there by 3 p.m, and if I don't, I'm sure, knowing my mother, she's a nervous person, she'll call the police if I'm not there. Once I said this, the driver looked steadfastly ahead and made no comment. I didn't ask him if he was afraid my mother would call the police. I didn't want to challenge him about his fear or lack of fear, or cause him to demonstrate that he was afraid of nothing. We drove on then, in silence. I was watching the forest up ahead now with some interest, because it might be the last forest I would ever see. This was existentialism in action here. This was real existentialism, not in a textbook, not in any J.P. Sartre philosophy tome, or novel. This was real existentialism, wondering if in half an hour I would be alive. Windpipe. This guy was strong. He wasn't real big, but he was much stronger than I was and much, much angrier. And I had the distinct sense that the ones who are angriest are the ones who are best at killing others. The trees in this so-called forest, which had just been a dark line on the horizon, were now starting to distinguish themselves as individual elements there in the distance, clump-type shapes, like little clumps of broccoli off in the distance, gradually becoming distinct shapes unto themselves as we approached. It looked like we'd be at the forest now in no more than 4 or 5 minutes. I could see there was a sign for a road up ahead, a turning, a little road turning off into this deep, dark woods, a perfect place for strangling a kid, dumping his body. Maybe he'd strangled other kids and dumped their bodies there. Maybe it hadn't only been kids, maybe it had been old people, all sorts of people, women, men. Maybe not. Maybe he was playing with me. In any case, with considerable interest, I watched the forest become more of a forest until we were there at the turnoff road. And he drove past. He didn't stop. He didn't say anything, but he didn't turn off where I feared he might. I wasn't scared, but I did fear that he might turn off into that deep, dark wood. And in silence, but at considerable speed, we rode on north towards Chantilly. We didn't talk anymore. And when we got to the outskirts of Chantilly, we passed a sign that announced we were coming into Chantilly. It was just the name of the town, Chantilly. And I had learned in my hitchhiking that when you leave a town, then, on the far side of the town, there's a similar sign. Also says Chantilly, but this time with a diagonal line across through the name of the town to indicate you're leaving that town. And it occurred to me that what he had been proposing was to take my name, Richard in French, and he was going to draw a diagonal line through me and ditch my body in this deep, dark wood. I'd be crossed off. I'd be finished. But that didn't happen. The thought did occur to me, however. Maybe it made no sense. We passed on through the suburbs of Chantilly and approached the commercial district. When we came to the first cafe near the town square, he pulled into a parking slot, turned off the ignition, turned to me and said, "Tu voudrais boire un coca? Do you like a Coke?" A Coke. This man was offering a Coke now, after he had been offering to break my windpipe a few minutes earlier. Maybe he admired me for coming up with this story about my parents needing to know where I was, even though my parents didn't know where I was in all of continental Europe at that moment. They wouldn't have missed me for days until I hadn't turned up in London on the appointed day. My body would have been starting to decompose by the time they missed me. So he was offering me a Coke. Mostly what I wanted was to get my backpack out of the trunk of his car. We did that. He opened the trunk. I retrieved my backpack. We walked into the cafe, and he did indeed buy me a Coca-Cola. Bought himself a big beer, and he drained it in 2 or 3 great slugs, paid the bill, shook my hand, went back to his car, and drove away. I sat there, drinking the rest of my Coke, feeling its wonderful gaseous bubbles going down my throat. My throat still intact, still unbruised, still unbroken. And I thought to myself, I really should call the police. There was a phone kiosk there in the back of the cafe. I should call the police and alert them to this madman preying on teenagers in northern France. I should ask the police to search in that woods to see if they found any bodies. I should ask the police if there were any unexplained absences of teenagers in the area. I hadn't gotten the man's license plate number, but I could describe him quite accurately. I could describe his car. It had been a Renault, not a chauffeur-driven Renault, but a battered, early model Renault. I didn't call anyone. Hitchhiking was technically illegal in France. I didn't want to get in trouble myself. I was a foreigner there, visiting. Instead, I finished my drink, strapped on my backpack, and walked to the northern outskirts of Chantilly, beyond where the sign had its diagonal line, to a place where there was an adequate pull-off area for cars to stop for me. I turned to face the oncoming traffic and stuck out my thumb and hoped for the best.